It is the 14th of April 1912. The largest, most luxurious ship in the world has grazed an iceberg in the mid-Atlantic on her maiden voyage to New York. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, having conducted an inspection of the damage below deck, delivers his report to the captain. In little over 2 hours, the ship will sink. The captain's actions over the coming hours have been scrutinized ever since, as the most notorious maritime disaster in history is about to unfold. His name? Edward Smith, captain of the Titanic. The man known to history as Captain Edward Smith was born on the 27th of January 1850 at Wells Street in the town of Hanley in Staffordshire. Hanley is now part of the city of Stoke-on-Trent. His full baptismal name was Edward John Smith. There has been a debate as to what house the Smiths lived in on Wells Street. A blue plaque commemorating where the captain of the doomed Titanic grew up was once outside number 51 Wells Street. This disappeared years ago. It appears the Smiths lived both here and at number 86, moving during Edward's childhood after inheriting a second house on the street. Edward's father was also named Edward Smith, and Edward was named after him. Edward Sr. was a potter, a very common profession in Hanley and the Stoke-on-Trent region at that time, as this was the home of the Wedgwood Pottery Company, one of the great pottery companies of Imperial Britain. Smith Sr. later went into business for himself after he inherited a shop from his mother on her passing. As a result, the family could be said to have been middle class by the standards of Victorian Britain, though hardly wealthy. His mother was Catherine Smith. She had married Edward Sr. in 1841. Prior to this, she was married to a John or Joseph Hancock. Her maiden name was Marsh. She had 2 sons from her first marriage. Importantly, one of these sons, Joseph, who was born back in 1833, had joined the Merchant Navy just before Edward was born, creating a link between the Smith family and the sea from Edward's earliest days. Edward was born during a period in which seafaring was experiencing an incredible array of changes in Britain and globally. When the European age of exploration had commenced back in the 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese, Spanish, English, Dutch and French mariners had been setting off for vistas unknown on caravels and other ships that seem extremely small and primitive for the people on them to have achieved such great feats of discovery. By the 18th century, that was changing, and the European colonial powers had spread out around the world. Ships of the line of the kind that the Royal Navy were building by then had become sophisticated war machines, almost functioning as a small moving village at sea, housing hundreds of people. That began to change again in the first half of the 19th century. The advent of the Industrial Revolution saw steam power introduced into the mix, and also major innovations in metalworking. Thus, where in 1750 a ship was made almost entirely out of wood and was powered by wind and sail, by 1850, the year of Smith's birth, a growing number of new ships were being built out of iron and were powered by a combination of wind, and steam-powered engines fed by coal, the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. This was on the back of the maiden voyage of the SS Great Western, a ship built by one of Britain's great engineers, Isambard Kingdom Brunel, a steam-powered ship that had crossed from Bristol to New York in 1838, demonstrating that steam power could drastically reduce the time needed to cross the Atlantic Ocean and to do so more reliably than wind-powered ships. By the time Smith would go to sea, the iron and steam revolution in shipbuilding was well advanced. Edward would scarcely have been aware of much of this growing up in inland Hanley. What he knew of the sea in the 1850s and early 1860s would have been tales narrated by his half-brother. Instead, his childhood was spent far inland at Hanley. His parents were primitive Methodists, a religious group that had emerged within communities of potters in the English Midlands in the early 19th century and which was close to an austere form of Calvinism. He was sent to be educated at the British School in Etruria, a school established and run by the Wedgwood Potteries just west of Hanley. Reflecting on his memories of Smith here in the 1850s and early 1860s, when asked about his former schoolmate, half a century later in 1912, a boy who had been at the British school at the time stated that, quote, "Teddy was a genial and good schoolfellow, one always ready to give a kind of helping hand in any way to his mates." As was typical of teenagers in Victorian Britain, he left school at a young age and acquired a job at Etruria Forge in 1862 at just 12 years of age. In 1865, he went to visit his half-brother, who was working on a ship called the Senator Weber at the time. Impressed by marine life, he determined to become a mariner himself, and eventually managed to convince his parents to allow him to head off to sea. Thus, in 1867, he signed on with Andrew Gibson and Company, a Liverpool-based naval firm, and he headed off on board the Senator Weber himself at aged 17, the beginning of a 45-year-long naval career that would end in tragedy. Smith spent the next 3 years sailing on the Senator Weber. He was given an early promotion in 1868 through a piece of luck and family connections. His half-brother had been made captain of the ship by then, and on a voyage to America, 14 men deserted while the ship was in port in San Francisco. The mass desertion was a perfect opportunity for Joseph Hancock to promote his half-brother to the position of third mate, despite his lack of experience. After returning to England, he signed on with the Amoy, a Halifax-registered ship, though he did not serve long there before transferring again to the Madge Wildfire, another ship that sailed out of Liverpool. He was aware that if he wished to move up in the world, he would have to acquire something beyond experience of being at sea. Hence, in July 1871, he took and passed his exams to qualify as a second mate, and then, 2 years later, passed another exam to become a first mate. In between, he signed aboard the Record and travelled out to New Orleans. Voyages to Valparaiso and other ports in Argentina, Chile and Peru followed in the mid-1870s before he acquired his master's certificate. Based on this rapid completion of certificates and nearly a decade of experience, he was made an officer on board the Lizzie Fennel by Gibson & Co., who clearly had faith in him. Smith's eyes wandered elsewhere, though. In January 1880, while in Liverpool, he spotted the Britannic, a ship of the White Star Line Company. The ship was 5 times larger than the Lizzie Fennel and more formidable in every way. Within days, Smith had obtained a pass to tour the Britannic and was petitioning to join the White Star Company. He got his wish. Smith had just become an employee of one of the emerging giants of transatlantic transportation. The White Star Line was founded in Liverpool in 1845 by John Pilkington and Henry Wilson. It started out as a charter company which hired ships to use and then, later, switched to building some of the largest passenger ships the world had ever seen as it became more and more successful. Its growth was predicated on one of the greatest mass migrations in human history, one which formed the backdrop of Smith's entire career and the infamous conclusion to it. While the European age of exploration and colonization had led to the migration of over 2 million people to the Americas from Europe between 1500 and 1800, this was completely dwarfed by what happened in the 19th century. Industrialization, improved diets, the introduction of vaccines, the medical revolution, and a complete lack of family planning led to an explosion of population levels in Europe. As a result, in excess of 25 million Europeans crossed the Atlantic in the 19th century, most heading for countries like the United States, Canada, Brazil, and Argentina. Companies like White Star absolutely boomed as a result, particularly so from the 1840s onwards, after the steamships were introduced. These cut the average transatlantic travel time from nearly a month to closer to 10 days, and as new innovations in shipbuilding appeared in the second half of the 19th century, the travel time fell further. As it did, tickets to find a new life in the new world became cheaper, and more people left their old lives behind. Consider that 4.5 million Irish people alone arrived to the United States between 1820 and 1920. Then we begin to understand why a company like White Star that was established in an Irish seaport like Liverpool, which often had ships stopping in Ireland as their last port of call before striking out across the Atlantic, and having its ships built in the port of Belfast in the north of Ireland, could turn enormous profits. This was the company Smith joined in 1880. A prerequisite of joining up with the White Star Line was that Smith had to accept a demotion, stepping back down to the post of 4th officer on the Celtic. He soon acquired the post of 2nd officer on the Coptic, a ship he was assigned to which was doing runs between Britain and New Zealand and parts of South America. These were cattle runs, delivering livestock from Britain and Ireland to parts of the world with limited cattle stocks and booming populations. It was on the less desirable end of work with White Star, though he was quickly rewarded by an appointment to the Britannic, the ship that had inspired him to join the company in 1880. He served on the ship for a year and a half between the spring of 1884 and the late summer of 1885, undertaking 15 transatlantic voyages as 2nd officer. This was his first major experience of working as an officer on ocean liner ships where he had to deal with passengers. Most of his naval experience up to that point had been on merchant navy ships transporting cargo rather than people. Back on dry land, he had started courting Sarah Eleanor Pennington, a woman 11 years his junior and the daughter of a farmer. They married at the parish church in Winwick in Lancashire on the 13th of January 1887, when he was 2 weeks shy of his 37th birthday and she was 26 years old. The newlyweds settled in Liverpool, where so much of White Star's operations were still based, and lived at number 39 Cambridge Road and then 17 Marine Crescent in the Waterloo district of the city. They would only have one child, a daughter named Helen Melville, born in 1898, over a decade after they first married. Perhaps the lack of children in Edward and Eleanor's marriage was down to how much time he spent at sea. The years after he married were important ones in his career. He acquired his master's certificate and, in 1888, he secured his first full command when he was made captain of the Baltic. He joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve the same year and was given the honorary rank of lieutenant. Though Britain would not become involved in a major war during his lifetime of the kind which would have necessitated calling upon naval reserves. After his stint as captain of the Baltic, he rotated in the late 1880s and early 1890s through various posts as captain of several ships he had previously served on in more junior capacities, notably the Republic, the Celtic, and the Coptic. There were several incidents. While sailing off Sandy Hook in North America on the way to New York City on the 27th of January 1889, he ended up grounding the Republic for 5 hours. A major furnace incident followed after reaching New York, in which 3 people died and several were badly injured. In his report into the matter, Smith downplayed what had happened. Just under 2 years later, in December 1890, he ran the Coptic aground as he was sailing out of Rio de Janeiro. These were not necessarily unusual incidents by late Victorian standards. Navigational instruments were less foolproof, and health and safety standards were much less stringent. Nevertheless, they do point to some slight issues in Smith's capabilities as a captain. In 1895, Smith was appointed to what would become the most sustained command of his career. That year, he was made captain of the Majestic, a relatively new White Star Line steamship that had only been launched in 1890. 4 years earlier, it had earned the Blue Riband, an award issued for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic by a ship, when it completed the journey in 6 days, travelling at an average of just over 20 knots. It's a sign of how pioneering naval travel was at this time that the Majestic only held the record for 2 weeks before it was claimed by the Teutonic, Majestic's sister ship in White Star's Teutonic-class ships. Smith would captain the Majestic for nearly 9 years. It operated primarily as an ocean liner on the Western Europe to New York run, but for a time it was deployed to South Africa, transporting British troops that were sent to the British colonies there during the Second Boer War, fought between 1899 and 1902. For his service in this, he was awarded with the Transport Medal, with the South Africa Clasp by King Edward VII in 1903. In 1901, a peculiar incident occurred when the Majestic was on a run to New York. a fire erupted in a linen closet, one which some crew decided to try and extinguish by cutting a small hole in the ship. A very bad idea, given that the fire was electrical in nature. The strange thing is that Smith only seems to have been notified of the fire much later, suggesting that he was not always aware of what was occurring on his own ship. It indicates a laissez-faire attitude towards being captain, which some historians of the Titanic have identified as playing a role in the later disaster. By the mid-1900s, Smith was nearing a quarter of a century of service with the White Star Line and had emerged as one of its most important captains. He was consequently given charge of the Baltic in 1904. This should not be confused with the ship of the same name that he had served on in a more junior role back in the 1880s. That earlier ship had been sold by White Star to the Holland America Line in 1888 and ultimately sank in 1898. White Star resurrected the name a few years later and christened one of their new ships, completed in 1903, with it. This was part of the Big Four, a class of 4 ships built for White Star at this time by the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast, Ireland, the other 3 being the Celtic, the Cedric, and the Adriatic. When it was launched in 1903, the Baltic was the largest ship in the world. It did not sail until 1904, and when it did, Smith was captain of it. Under Smith, the Baltic began regular runs between Liverpool to New York. Owing to issues which had arisen during the building process, the machinery on board faltered regularly, and the ship did not perform as well as White Star had intended. This had little to do with Smith's work as captain. In 1907, White Star moved their base of operations from Liverpool to Southampton, a move designed to take advantage of changing migratory patterns as a growing number of European migrants to the Americas who travelled on White Star ocean liners were coming from the continent, and a port of embarkation in the English Channel was preferable now. As White Star moved to the southern port, Smith purchased a large manor house in the upmarket Westwood Park region of Southampton and moved his family there. By the time he was appointed to captain the Adriatic, he had acquired a sort of celebrity amongst the captains of Southampton, a large man who sometimes brought his wolfhound with him on ship and who had a fondness for cigars. Around the time Smith was moving to Southampton in 1907, the company he worked for was embarking on its most ambitious project ever. There were good reasons for doing so. The transatlantic passenger industry was at its absolute peak. 1907 was the busiest year at the Immigration Center on Ellis Island in New York City. The busiest day in the center's history was the 17th of April 1907, when just over 11,700 people traversed through the concourse seeking to live in the United States. In response to this unprecedented rise in migration across the Atlantic, and also the launching of the Lusitania, a flagship of White Star's great rival, the Cunard Line, White Star decided to build a new class of passenger liner. These would be known as the Olympic class of ocean liners. Joseph Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star, agreed with Harland and Wolff in Belfast that they would build 3 such ships. They would be the largest ocean liners in the world once completed. Work began on the ships in Belfast in 1908, and continued for 4 years on what were to be known as the Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. The Olympic was completed in 1911, the Titanic in 1912, and the Britannic in 1914. Of these, it was planned that the Titanic would be the largest of the three, hence the naming of it after the Titans, the generation of Greek gods and goddesses who had ruled the universe in its earliest days before being overthrown by the Olympians. The pathos of the ship being named after a class of fallen gods was not entirely lost on others after its tragic maiden voyage in 1912. The first of the 3 Olympic-class ships to be completed was the RMS Olympic. It was built by the beginning of the summer of 1911 and, unlike the Titanic a year later, was then sent for sea trials to test everything on the ship in advance of its maiden voyage. These sea trials were undertaken on the 29th of May 1911. 2 days later, the ship left Belfast. This was the same day the Titanic was released from the slipway at the Harland and Wolff shipyards into Belfast Harbour, its hull touching water for the first time. Incredibly, it would be ready to sail itself just 10 months later, with Harland and Wolff allocating 3,000 workers to finishing the ship. The timing of its launch into the water was not coincidental, and White Star had planned it so the Titanic was launched into the water the very same day the Olympic set off on its maiden voyage. The Olympic was bound on the same route that the Titanic would take less than a year later. It went from Belfast to Liverpool, where the ship was formally registered, and then onwards to Southampton. It would begin picking up passengers there before proceeding to Cherbourg in France, then Queenstown in Southern Ireland, and then onwards to New York City. When the Olympic arrived at Southampton, Smith boarded it. He was to captain the ship on its maiden voyage, just as he would the Titanic the following year. Such was the size of the ships Smith was now taking command of that the dock at Southampton had been adapted in advance for the first arrival of the Olympic to ensure it could actually enter the harbour. In the case of the Olympic, the maiden voyage went according to plan and generated fantastic press attention for White Star and Smith when he guided it into New York Harbour in late June 1911. While the initial voyage went well, Smith ran into trouble during the 5th transatlantic voyage of the Olympic. On the 20th of September 1911, the ship collided with the HMS Hawke in the Solent, the strip of water between the south coast of England and the Isle of Wight. As they neared each other, the Olympic turned to starboard. This took the captain of the Hawke somewhat by surprise, and he had failed to prevent the ship from crashing into the side of the White Star passenger liner. The Hawke was badly damaged and nearly sank, though the much larger Olympic managed to make it back to port in Southampton. It was then sent to Belfast for more extensive repairs. Back in service by November, it suffered propeller damage in February 1912, all signs of some degree of fragility in the new ships. Smith had not been piloting the Olympic at the time of the collision with the Hawke. The chief officer, Henry Wilde, had been on duty. In any event, neither man was responsible for the incident. The issue lay with the sheer size of the Olympic. Owing to its weight in the water when it turned to starboard, it had effectively sucked the Hawke towards it, causing the collision. This was a novel problem of seafaring caused by the sheer size of the Olympic-class ships. More worrying was that the Hawke had managed to puncture through the hull of the Olympic, creating 2 large holes and leading to flooding in 2 of the watertight compartments. For ships that White Star was billing as being unsinkable, the incident had quickly pointed up the vulnerabilities of the Olympic-class ships. Smith continued to captain the Olympic until the Titanic was ready to sail the following spring, at least when it was seaworthy and not being patched up in Belfast. White Star did not delay once the Titanic was completed to have it embark on its maiden voyage. The final adjustments were made to the ship on the 2nd of April 1912, and it was scheduled to make its first transatlantic voyage immediately. The route involved a number of stops. It would sail first from Belfast to Southampton, the main port of disembarkation for White Star ships from southern England. It would pick up some passengers here, then proceed west through the English Channel, picking up some French and continental customers in the port of Cherbourg along the way. The last stop was at the port of what was then called Queenstown in Southern Ireland, near the city of Cork. This is known as Cove today. It was intended that it would depart from Queenstown on the 11th of April, just 9 days after the final work had been carried out in Belfast. It would then swing slightly northwards to follow one of the main North Atlantic oceanic routes along the Newfoundland banks in northeastern Canada. It would then descend southwards towards New England and finally to the port of New York City. Although the common perception that White Star wanted to break the transatlantic record for an ocean liner and acquire the blue riband is a myth, the voyage would still be a swift one, with the plan being to be in New York on the 17th of April. A major issue with this plan was that a considerable fire had been burning in the coal bunker of the ship since before the Titanic left Belfast. Fires like this were not uncommon in ocean liners of the early 20th century, but this one smouldered for 2 weeks, and photographs of the ship in the days before it left Ireland show a long 30-foot black streak on the hull of the ship that suggests some damage caused by it. This wouldn't sink the ship by itself, though it could have weakened the hull should anything hard, like a large iceberg, hit it. The ship which Smith now took command of was greater in size than the Olympic. At 882 foot in length and standing 175 foot high from the keel at the base of the ship to the top of the 4 very large and iconic funnels that towered over the ship's deck, it was the largest passenger ship afloat anywhere in the world as Smith stood onto its deck for the first time in April 1912. It is not difficult to see why some viewed the ship as being unsinkable. It weighed over 46,000 tons and was fueled by 159 furnaces and 29 boilers that swallowed up 600 tons of coal every day to keep the ship cruising along at nearly 40 kilometers per hour. At full capacity, the Titanic would have been able to hold nearly 2,400 passengers across its 9 decks, along with over 800 staff. It was fortuitous that a strike amongst coal miners was underway in Britain in the spring of 1912, leading to trains to Southampton not running and reduced passenger loads. Hence, the Titanic set off on its maiden voyage with not much more than 1,300 passengers and just under 900 staff. A total complement of around 2,240 people was on board. These included individuals like Bruce Ismay, the chairman of White Star and architect of the plan to build the Olympic-class ships, and the American business magnate John Jacob Astor IV. This was the ship which Smith led out from Southampton to Ireland and then the Atlantic in mid-April 1912. 2/3 of those who stood on the deck of the ship in Southampton, Sherbrooke and Queenstown stepped off dry land for the last time, never to return. Smith's conduct as captain of the Titanic would be endlessly scrutinized in the aftermath of the sinking of the ship and has been ever since. He has often been portrayed as an individual who was shirking his responsibilities as a captain and instead ordering his crew to make top speed across the Atlantic, hoping to set a new record for a ship crossing from Britain and Ireland to New York. The reality is that there wasn't a huge amount that was controversial about Smith's captaining of the Titanic. The ship travelled along at a fairly moderate speed of 22 knots on the 12th and 13th of April. He did not hold boat drills. A brief demonstration of the crew's ability to lower the lifeboats had been carried out before an inspector of the Board of Trade in Southampton before departing, and Smith considered this sufficient. Few would have thought he should have done anything differently. He did spend some time socializing with the first-class passengers in the evenings and led Protestant church services there, but this was not unusual either. In fact, in some ways, it was part of the job brief for a captain of a White Star ocean liner. He wasn't neglecting his duties. It was procedure for the first and second officer and the navigators to be carrying out much of the actual work of steering the ship. The main thing that he did that was controversial was in failing to take seriously enough warnings on the morning of the 14th of April that the sea route along the coast of Newfoundland and Labrador was dotted with icebergs, a not uncommon development for that time of year. He passed one of these messages to Ismay, who hung on to it for several hours, but a separate message about icebergs had been posted in the bridge of the ship. There was no negligence in making news about the icebergs known to the other senior crewmen. The cause of the sinking of the Titanic is well known. It hit an iceberg. As noted on the morning of the 14th of April, Smith had received notice of icebergs in the waters off Newfoundland that the ship was just heading into. He didn't decide to change course. Again, this was not owing to an effort to break any record for the voyage from Ireland to New York. Smith simply believed that the icebergs off Newfoundland did not pose a major threat to the ship. People in the early 20th century thought that enormous ships like the Olympic-class ocean liners simply could not be sunk by icebergs. Therefore, Smith did not direct his ship to change course or take any other preventative measures. There is no record of any of the senior crewmen dissenting from that view. It was a tragic decision. All seemed well when Smith visited the bridge shortly before 9 p.m. on the evening of the 14th of April. Less than 3 hours later, at approximately 11:40 p.m., the lookout on the deck of the ship, a man named Frederick Fleet, spotted the enormous block of ice that sank the most famous ship in the world. It was immediately in front of the Titanic, only 500 yards away when it hove into view from the darkness. From the crow's nest, Fleet immediately notified the bridge by ringing his bell and roaring out that there was an iceberg dead ahead. In the bridge, the crew took preventative measures. As a result, the ship did not plough straight into the iceberg. Instead, it glanced off the side of the iceberg on the starboard side. The collision was substantial, though many people on board might not have been overly concerned by it at the time. Some did not even hear it. Instead, the first thing they noticed that was amiss was the sound of the engine stopping about 5 minutes later. Smith had turned in around 9:30 p.m. shortly after visiting the bridge. He was soon up after the collision and began to head around the ship to assess the extent of the damage. It quickly became apparent how bad the situation was. The Titanic had been built so that 4 of the lower compartments could be flooded and it would still remain afloat. The impact from the iceberg had forced apart the plates along a 300-foot-long section of the hull. Water had then flooded into 3 of the hull compartments and 2 of the boiler rooms, 5 compartments in all. As a consequence, the ship began to let in more water than its pumps could handle, although the engines had been stopped intentionally to slow the spread of the water. As this happened, the ship began to flood and sink, slowly at first, then faster. Instead, it was going down. Smith realized this quite quickly as Thomas Andrews, the managing director of the ship's builders Harland and Wolff, and the ship's naval architect or designer, who was on board the vessel on her maiden voyage, had conducted an appraisal of the damage below deck after the collision and eventually came to the horrendous conclusion that the ship was doomed. White flare distress rockets were set off minutes later. It has been recently speculated that if the integrity of the hull had not been compromised by the fire in the coal pits over the previous 2 weeks, then the hull might have remained sufficiently intact to flood just 3 or 4 compartments, in which case the ship could have made it to port. Curiously, Mayday signals were not sent out until 12:10, a serious oversight. Initially, there was a strong hope that the radio signals might have brought salvation. A large ship, the Californian, was very nearby and had basically slowed to a near halt overnight to avoid hitting the ice. Indeed, the ship had radioed the Titanic 45 minutes before the iceberg hit, warning about the speed the Titanic was travelling at. But in the radio room of the Titanic, they had told the Californian to stop interfering with their radios as they were trying to send messages which had been passed to them by the first and second class passengers. As the crew of the Titanic waited to see what the response of the Californian might be, Smith began taking steps to abandon ship. There were lifeboats on board. The only issue was that the ship was fitted with just 20 of these. They were relatively large boats in and of themselves, ones that could accommodate approximately 60 people each at full capacity. Yet, even with the Titanic nowhere near a full complement of passengers, this was still insufficient. It was better than nothing, and had the lifeboats been launched and boarded in a proper manner, nearly 1,200 people, just over half the crew and passengers on the maiden voyage, would have survived. However, that isn't what happened. Smith ordered the lifeboats to be swung out and for women and children to begin boarding first. There was no public announcement system or loudspeaker available to coordinate efforts to abandon ship, and without any lifeboat drills having been carried out before the voyage, beyond a brief test in Southampton Harbour, the crew were unsure how to even manage the boarding of the lifeboats. When people finally made it to the deck and were provided with life jackets, many wives were reluctant to leave behind husbands. Others believed that the Californian, the lights of which could dimly be seen in the distance, would soon come to the rescue of the Titanic, and that it was safer to remain on board than risk the open sea on a lifeboat. Smith also compounded the problems being experienced by waiting until after midnight before finally giving the order to launch the lifeboats. Then, as the ship began to sink, some of the lifeboats cast off with nowhere near a full complement of passengers, in some cases with little more than 20 or 30 first and second class passengers on board. The first lifeboats struck off at 12:45, just over an hour after the iceberg had first hit. One could blame Smith for some of these issues in boarding the lifeboats, but in reality, he was dealing with a wide array of issues between midnight and 1 a.m. He knew that the best hope for the stricken ship, and the only possibility that he himself might survive, was if they managed to get a nearby ship to respond and come to their rescue before the Titanic went down. Saving that, it was imperative to get a ship to them as quickly as possible to pluck the survivors out of the icy water before they froze to death or drowned. Knowing this, he would have been dismayed to learn that the Californian was not responding. It would later be determined that the ship's sole radio operator had gone to bed for the night. Many people on board the ship could see the Titanic, and the lookouts on the Californian even saw the distress rockets being fired, but such was the brightness of the Titanic's lights and other features of the ship that those on board the Californian simply did not realize that anything untoward was occurring. As it became clear on board the Titanic that the nearby ship was not turning or coming to their aid, they continued to send out desperate, calling all ship distress messages. The ocean liner Carpathia responded. It was 58 miles away and would take hours to reach the Titanic. Having done what they could, Smith eventually dismissed the radio operators and told them to try and make what escape they could. Meanwhile, on deck, Bruce Ismay, the head of White Star, boarded the last lifeboat to cast off with just 45 passengers on board. It should be noted that in recent years the assertion that the Titanic not holding enough lifeboats for all its passengers as being a design flaw or in some way negligent on the part of its builders has been largely debunked. The reason for this is that the Titanic's sinking, although tragic, could have been much worse, as she sank on an even keel, meaning the ship did not capsize or turn over as she sank. In the vast majority of ship sinkings through history, the weight of the water entering the ship rapidly tips the vessel off balance, causing it to roll over in the water. This meant that in the majority of sinkings, loading the lifeboats on either side of a ship was almost impossible, resulting in a large proportion of those on board ending up in the water regardless. The fact that the Titanic went down on an even keel, which was caused by the water entering her hull at a relatively steady rate, enabled the vast majority of her lifeboats to be launched, meaning more passengers were saved. In any event, the lifeboats on board ships like the Titanic were meant as ferries, which were to be used in emergencies to transport people from one stricken ship to another rescue ship. In short, it was not practice at the time for ships to carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board, and as most sinkings involved the vessels capsizing, there was no way to safeguard passengers for the myriad of ways a particular ship might sink. This is as true today as it was then. As well as this, the Titanic very nearly avoided sinking, as if the order had been given to turn the ship to avoid the iceberg a fraction sooner, less than 5 of its watertight compartments would have been breached, and the ship, along with its passengers, would have survived. Combined with this, the unusually calm and cold weather conditions on the night of the sinking meant the air temperature just above sea level was so low that, from a distance, the rockets being fired from the Titanic's deck, as well as the ship's Morse lamps, could not be seen properly. As well as this, the water into which the more unfortunate passengers were plunged was below freezing, meaning that on contact with the water, one's fate was all but sealed, as the body would quickly go into shock. All in all, although many have done their best to attribute blame on all the parties involved in the disaster, the truth is that the sinking of the Titanic was largely down to incredibly bad luck. The fact that the vessel was the largest ever built, carrying so many passengers on her maiden voyage, sealed the sinking as the most notorious maritime disaster in history. Many questions were asked at the time about Smith's response to the ship being hit, and whether he could have done more to prevent so many passengers losing their lives. Perhaps if he had been more alert, the lifeboats would not have been allowed to cast off from the Titanic without a full complement of passengers, in which case hundreds more people would have been saved. This line of thought is probably unfair. The Titanic was hit around 11:40 p.m. and, as we will see, it sank around 2:20 a.m. That is a window of approximately 160 minutes. Moreover, it took some time at the beginning for the significance of what had occurred to become clear, while the last period of time from just after 2 a.m. onwards involved the ship breaking in half and entering its final death throes. That means there was essentially a 2-hour window in which Smith had to react to what had happened, decide what to do, and begin overseeing efforts to abandon ship. During that same time, he also had to liaise with other crew members and keep abreast of efforts to radio for help from the Californian and other ships like the Carpathia. The sheer act of readying 20 lifeboats for launching and getting people to the deck to board them without a public announcement system on a ship of the size of the Titanic was logistically difficult, and, as all of this was going on, Smith would have been dealing with people who were understandably becoming more and more panicked. While there may be question marks over how he captained the ship and dealt with the emergency, one also needs to put themselves in his shoes when evaluating what he did during this 160-minute period. Indeed, the reports that some of those who survived the sinking made later that Smith seemed to be unresponsive or in denial about what was happening could just as easily be viewed as the actions of a captain who was trying to remain calm and keep those around him from panicking. By the time Smith dismissed the radio operators, it was beyond doubt that the ship was sinking and sinking a lot faster than many people had expected. With so many compartments of the ship having been breached in the initial impact and the period that followed, water had been streaming steadily into it since shortly before midnight. The issue was how long it would take for so much water to flood into the ship that it weighed it down below the surface. By around 1:30 a.m., the front of the ship where the compartments had first started to flood was weighed down to the extent that it was starting to dip under the water. People by then would have been walking on a ship that was starting to become noticeably slanted. The last lifeboats to be launched struck off just after 2 a.m. It was an easier operation by that time, as the boats did not have to be lowered. The deck had dipped down to the surface of the water and then started to go under it. A few minutes later, the lights went out across the ship as the electricity system failed. Around the same time, the stern of the ship started to rise out of the water as the weight differential became so severe that it lifted the rear entirely out of the water, turning it at a 90-degree angle. For a few brief minutes, onlookers in the lifeboats would have witnessed the ship's enormous propellers rising out of the water and then standing towering over the sea. Then the ship snapped in half. The front of the ship, which was already underwater, sank rapidly once this occurred. The rear half of the ship lay sideways on the surface of the sea for a few minutes as water rushed in, replacing the air that was keeping it floating on the water. Once enough water had flooded in, it too began to sink. This process accelerated as the moments ticked by, and around 2:20 a.m., the remains of the Titanic went underwater and it began descending to its watery grave. There are different accounts of Smith's whereabouts and response to what was occurring as the ship entered its death throes not long after 2 a.m. There was little else for him to do now as captain. The lifeboats had been launched, mayday signals had been issued, and rescue sought, while the order to abandon ship to everyone who could not be accommodated on the lifeboats had been made. There was now nothing left for Smith except to go down with his ship. From statements later made by those few individuals who were still on the ship and who managed to survive, Smith was not wearing a life jacket. His body would never be recovered, suggesting this is true, as his body would otherwise possibly have stayed floating on the surface of the water after the ship went fully down. One witness, George A. Braden, later claimed that, quote, "I saw Captain Smith when I was in the water. He was standing on the deck all alone. Once he was swept down by a wave, but managed to get to his feet again. Then, as the boat sank, he was again knocked down by a wave and disappeared from view." This account was published in the Times newspaper a few days after the disaster. There were already conflicting accounts by then about Smith's last moments. Another newspaper stated that he was seen on the deck with a pistol, the implications being that he took his own life. This is not given credibility today. Instead, the account of the wireless operator, Harold Bride, who claimed Smith dived off the bridge of the ship and presumably drowned afterwards, is more likely. Another witness still suggested that Smith had swum with an infant to a lifeboat before swimming back to the ship, drowning at some point thereafter. We'll never know for sure, what happened in his last moments. The last moments of so many of the others who lost their lives in the tragedy of the Titanic are equally unclear. By the time the ship entered its death throes around 2 a.m., there were undoubtedly already scores of people dead in the compartments that had flooded. Then, when the ship started to sink properly around 2 a.m., hundreds of people were cast into the water. Others tried to cling to the ship as the rear of it rose out of the water. Many fell to their deaths, though some would have managed to stay alive on the wreckage of the ship until it descended into the water. Once it went down, everyone who had not made it to a lifeboat was on their own in the ocean. The water temperature is estimated to have been -2 degrees Celsius that night. People can only survive submerged in water of this kind for about half an hour before their body systems collapse from the cold. At that stage, they either go into cardiac arrest or they become unable to stay above the surface of the water. When the Carpathia finally made it to the site of the sinking of the Titanic, it found just over 700 survivors, of which approximately 70% were passengers, mostly from first and second class, and 30% were crew. A little over 1,500 people died in the sinking of the ship captained by Smith. The precise number is not clear, owing to a disagreement over how many people were on board at the time. The survivors were brought to New York after the rescue operation was completed. There, the passengers described how, when the sun rose the morning after the catastrophe, they had passed through waters that were dotted with icebergs, several of which were described as being 200 foot high. Even allowing for an understandable tendency to exaggerate the size of these in the aftermath of the accident, it is clear that the waters here had been much more treacherous than expected. Reports also emerged of one iceberg seen with a distinctive red and black streak on it, evidence, perhaps, of contact with a large ship recently. It was one of many newspaper reports in New York, London, and elsewhere concerning the ship in the course of April 1912. Perhaps the strangest story that emerged in the aftermath of the disaster was one which claimed that Smith was still alive. In July 1912, a man from Baltimore by the name of Peter Prial claimed that he had seen Smith walking around the Maryland city. What made the story more believable was that Prial had worked on board the Majestic around 15 years earlier when Smith was the captain of that ship. He therefore was well placed to identify him. He even claimed to have met Smith a second time, and on that occasion Smith cheekily referred to him as shipmate before boarding a train to Washington. Prial was clearly not given to delusions. His doctor even went on the record to attest that he was of sound mind and not lying. Supposed sightings of Smith occurred on a few further occasions, though there is no concrete evidence to support the idea that he somehow survived the sinking of his ship. On the contrary, it is completely implausible that he could have made it into one of the lifeboats, then onto the Carpathia, and finally into the port of New York without ever being identified. A public investigation was initiated immediately after the sinking of Smith's ship. These occurred in 2 different jurisdictions on account of the Titanic having been bound for New York, and the White Star Line being a company that did extensive business in the United States while being based out of Britain. The US Senate inquiry ran for 6 weeks between mid-April and late May, calling scores of survivors to come before it and give testimony. Bruce Ismay appeared, and he claimed that he and Smith had conversed about the voyage and had agreed that there was no rush. They weren't trying to break any sort of speed record. The second officer on the ship, Charles Lightoller, also testified. He stated that he had talked with Smith just under 3 hours before the iceberg struck, and at that time Smith had told him that they were in no rush and that they would slow down if conditions necessitated it. In England, hearings were held by the British Board of Trade. They were more scrupulous, seeking out independent experts to testify about how Smith had handled the situation. They concluded that the officers in the bridge of the ship were sufficiently well informed about there being ice in the area that Smith could not be held entirely responsible for the fate that befell his ship. In its final report, the board noted that he had made some mistakes as captain, but these fell within the realm of understandable human error rather than reckless or negligent behavior. Effectively, they exonerated him. Some recommendations were put forward to avoid future accidents, the most important of all being that going forward ocean liners were to carry enough lifeboats and rafts for every passenger on board to be able to abandon ship if needed. Smith's legacy was mixed after the tragedy that befell the Titanic. Many people blamed him for the disaster. Others extolled his courage. Writing to a friend in the summer of 1912, his widow, Eleanor, noted that there were some who were attempting to besmirch his good name, but others that were doing the very opposite. A brass plaque had already been set up in Hanley to mark the place where he was born and grew up, and another memorial at the school he had attended. A charity event was also being held to provide for the families of Smith and the many other crew members who had lost their lives in the sinking. Eleanor seemed to be particularly proud of reports that her husband had swum with a child to safety before he drowned, writing, "It is quite true and so like him." She also sent her correspondent, Frank, a photo of her husband as captain of the Olympic and a copy of the menu. Eleanor eventually left Southampton and went to live in London. She died there in 1931 after being knocked down by a taxi. Her and Edward's daughter, Helen, organised for a statue of her father to be erected in Lichfield, in England, in 1914. She married twice, with both of her husbands dying prematurely. The first was a sea captain, Captain John Gilbertson of Liverpool, who was the youngest captain ever of a merchant navy ship, but who sadly lost his life at sea after contracting black water fever. Both of Helen's children from her second marriage died young in the 1940s, and her second husband passed in 1930, 8 years after they were wed. Despite her difficulties, she lived a full life, becoming a pioneering sports car driver and an aeroplane pilot. The White Star Line continued to experience a number of problems in the years that followed. Just over 2 years after the Titanic went down, the First World War broke out across Europe, bringing transatlantic mass migration to an abrupt halt. People could no longer move between countries at home in Europe easily to get to ports, to sail for the New World, and when they did, there was no guarantee of safety. In particular, unrestricted German submarine warfare meant that passenger ships were often in danger of being sunk, even if they were non-combatants, as those travelling on the Lusitania discovered to their dismay when the ship they were travelling on was sunk off the coast of Ireland in 1915. In this environment, White Star repurposed many of their ships to serve wartime functions. One of the Titanic's sister ships in the Olympic class, the Britannic, became a British hospital ship serving in the Mediterranean. On the morning of the 21st of November 1916, the ship hit a German mine in the waters off the Greek island of Kea, though in this instance almost all of the passengers were rescued, as there were ships in the vicinity to call on, the waters weren't freezing, and there was a much greater provision of lifeboats, a legacy of the lessons learned from the Titanic. It is peculiar, though, that 2 of the 3 Olympic-class ships were gone just a few years after they were first launched. Still, it was not flagships being sunk or wartime market changes that led to White Star's demise in the end. The company actually rebounded quite well after the end of the war as pent-up demand for transatlantic passage was released. Instead, it was changing demographic patterns. Europe's population explosion stabilized in the early 20th century, and by the 1920s, the mass migration to the Americas that characterized the 19th century was coming to an end. Ships like the Titanic were consequently no longer in vogue. The Great Depression dealt the last blow to the company, and White Star merged with its great rival Cunard in 1934, with Cunard becoming the more dominant entity. Smith's reputation has gone through many changes in the century and more since the ship he captained famously sank. As we have seen, at the time much of the blame was placed on his shoulders. There were reasons for this. It was useful for White Star and for many others to suggest that Smith was to blame for not slowing down or showing adequate caution, but in reality, he was following the same procedures that every captain of a major transatlantic passenger ship did at the time. This pattern of interpreting Smith's actions to suit a particular agenda continued for decades to come. For instance, in 1943, one of the first major cultural depictions of the sinking of the ship, a German film entitled Titanic, appeared in cinemas. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, had played a considerable role in the project, and Smith, the English captain, played in this instance by Otto Wernicke, was made to look bad. In this rendering, the first officer, who in reality was William McMaster Murdoch, a Scotsman, was presented as having been German. The German first officer complains to Smith that they are travelling recklessly, which Smith ignores, leading to the disaster. Thus, Smith's actions were interpreted in light of the German wartime need to vilify Britain. Many other depictions on stage and screen followed. The Academy Award winner George C. Scott was probably the most famous actor to play Smith. He did so in a 1996 television series, but that portrayal is almost entirely forgotten today, eclipsed by Bernard Hill's depiction of Smith in James Cameron's 1997 film Titanic. While Cameron's film noted that the primary issue when it came to the disaster was the lack of lifeboats, which, as we have explored, there were good reasons for, Smith was unfairly portrayed as being overtly inactive and dithering once disaster struck, whilst most of the British crew were also inaccurately portrayed in a negative light, as the vast majority of them carried out their duties with the greatest professionalism and heroism, many dying as they did so. Captain Edward J. Smith is a much maligned figure in popular culture, often viewed as being responsible for the sinking of the Titanic and the deaths of just over 1,500 crew and passengers on board. His ascent to become the captain of that ship was peculiar in some ways. He hailed from Hanley in Stoke-on-Trent, an inland town well away from the sea and primarily famous in Victorian times for its pottery. Smith was drawn to a naval life because of his half-brother's work as a merchant seaman. Once Smith went to sea himself as a teenager, he never looked back. At the start of his 30s, he began working for the famous White Star Line, and in 1887, he became captain of a major passenger liner for the first time. He certainly was not inexperienced by the time he was made captain of the Titanic on its maiden voyage in 1912. It was a major honour, the Titanic being one of the 3 ships of the prestigious Olympic-class ships built by White Star. Neither Smith nor his ship would survive that maiden voyage. There could be many criticisms made of the captain. Perhaps he should have altered course when he was informed about icebergs being spotted off Newfoundland. Perhaps he was indecisive once the ship was struck, though there are hugely conflicting reports about that. The reality, though, is that Smith had very little role to play in the major reasons for the disaster. It was common practice for ships to simply sail onwards when reports of icebergs emerged in the early 20th century, while the issue of the lack of lifeboats on the Titanic to accommodate all the passengers when the ship was fatally struck was nothing to do with Smith, and not unusual. Indeed, if the reports of Smith's final moments are to be believed, that the aging man did his best to swim children to lifeboats in the freezing water, then he placed the lives of everyone on board before his own to the very end, and evidently accepted his fate long before the ship went down. This is no small thing for a man with a wife and daughter at home who he surely knew he would never see again. With this in mind, along with the fact that he seems to have conducted himself calmly under colossal pressure in an unprecedented disaster, we must ask ourselves, would we have done any better? What do you think of Captain Edward Smith? Was he responsible in many ways for the tragedy that befell the Titanic and its passengers, or was he merely very unlucky and conducted himself with the utmost bravery, knowing his demise was certain? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.